I did my undergraduate work at North Texas State University in Denton, Texas, and I had a fabulous professor, Dr. Bonney, who talked about how you could learn more about the human psyche through the arts than by reading Freud. So he would let us do artwork instead of library papers, which was wonderful. And so he really piqued my interest as he brought in lots of very interesting examples from popular culture and from various pieces of literature and painters, and he just really spurred my interest in how the arts and psychology could fit together. And so when I was living in Washington, D.C., about 4 years later, a friend of mine said, there's a course in art therapy at the Washington School of Psychiatry. And so I went to register for it, and they didn't have very much in the way of prerequisites, just a passion for the subject. And then after taking 2 courses there, one of the professors from George Washington University came in one night and said, who wants a master's degree in art therapy? Well, it turned out this was one of only 4 schools that had started developing the idea of a master's degree. Now, there were art therapists practicing back in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, but there was no national organization, and there certainly weren't formal training programs. So George Washington was saying, let's experiment. We'll have a program if we can get enough people to take the courses. And so my hand shot up immediately when he said, who wants a master's? And so I was fortunate enough to get in on that very first class, and now that's 40 years after the fact. So I was very pleased that I could be in on the development of that program. The really wonderful thing about art therapy, it's an extremely potent idea. And if there weren't art therapists, professional art therapists practicing it, the idea would still merit a lot of attention. A lot of people think that they discovered it independently outside of some of the other well-known writers in the field, but it's such a natural fit because, of course, art is a language. And when you understand that language that comes all from the nonverbal hemisphere, then you're able to understand things that are difficult to understand, because especially those subjective experiences of psychosis or of dissociation are hard for people to understand if they haven't gone through them. But short of going through them, you can see what the effects are in a person's artwork. So when I finished my graduate degree, then Lou had hired me as the art therapist at this community hospital, and we started setting about on a rather ambitious program to have a different kind of treatment program that did focus on the nonverbal. That experience was wonderful because it was kind of like you opened a psychiatric textbook and you had an example of every type of disorder that you could imagine. So that was a good broad general education, but there was no mention of trauma. As I indicated earlier, people just weren't talking about it. And there was a certain reticence because the main kind of trauma that comes to mind when you mention the word is sexual trauma. And so people didn't want to implant a memory that wasn't there. They didn't want to suggest to suggestible people that maybe that was the root of the problem. But in truth, trauma covers so many different types of events. You can think about natural disasters such as tornadoes, forest fires. You can think about car accidents, about industrial accidents. Here in West Virginia, mining accidents are a big source of trauma. Combat trauma. Help me out here. Let's see. We have medical trauma, which is one of Lou's specialties. There are just so many things that can befall people in addition to sexual abuse. So it's unfortunately a very wide territory. But the wonderful thing that we've been able to figure out is that there's a common denominator under all of those traumas. And if we look at that common denominator and understand what that denominator is consisting of, then we can figure out some way to be able to address it. The nonverbal part of the brain is generally housed in the right hemisphere, and we don't have a means of communicating from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere until we're about 2.5 or 3 years of age. The right hemisphere has wonderful capacities, but it's not very disciplined. It doesn't think about order. It doesn't think about time sequence, but it's the source of creativity. It's also the source of flashbacks, nightmares, anxiety attacks, and other things such as that, because it stores all of the material that is part of the trauma experience. So the right brain is extremely important in both generating symptoms, but also in dealing with the symptoms. There is a favorite phrase about how the hand remembers what the mind forgot. And that's a very apt description of how art therapy taps into that part of the mind that has the creative potential for being able to create something out of chaos, and most important for trauma treatment, to be able to supply the missing elements. I think that the symptoms like flashbacks are not very well understood by either the lay public or by the people who are suffering the flashbacks. But think about it this way, that it's essentially coming from the right brain, and it's material that's out of context. The classic example of a flashback would be a combat veteran who hears a loud noise. It might be a car backfiring, or it might be some of the noise in his neighborhood, and all of a sudden he runs for cover because he's absolutely certain he's back in the war situation. Well, he's out of place and out of the time where he was actually in combat, but his right brain doesn't know that. When you take the fragments of the experience that become flashbacks and put them back into context, then the right brain settles down, and most of all, we can transmit that information to the left hemisphere. We do this by what we call a corpus callosal bypass. So let me dissect that. The corpus callosum is the structure in the brain that connects the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And since it doesn't really operate until a child is about 2.5 or 3 years of age, you're not going to get information being shared by the hemispheres. So it's as if we have two brains. And those two brains need to be coordinated in their experiences, but in trauma they're not. So the nonverbal material then gets stored in that nonverbal area of the brain. And when we do drawings, we can essentially bypass that corpus callosum, because we have the drawing that we can then present to the left hemisphere and be able to have the person step back at a distance and look at the drawings. And when that person then sees the drawings from the perspective of the left hemisphere, then the story is complete. And then the person can have the sense that that was then and this is now, that there is a difference between the flashback and the actual experience.